Hello. Today I'd like to talk about the layers of nostalgia that composers Hirokazu Tanaka and Keiichi Suzuki embedded in the music of Earthbound, a video game released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in North America in 1995 and earlier in Japan for the Super Famicom in 1994. To start, let's define nostalgia. No matter how rich of a life you lead, you will never experience the same carefree and unadulterated happiness that you felt in your single digits riding bikes with your neighborhood friends or getting to know your bunkmates at summer camp again. And even if those are events that you never personally experienced, you might still yearn for a similar imagined pastiche of good feelings fabricated from secondhand accounts and media portrayals. This pairing of the holistic happiness of recalling precious memories with the sharp sense of loss for the feelings that you will never experience again is nostalgia. In designing the sound of Earthbound, Tanaka and Suzuki creatively employed audio samples and references to produce a soundtrack that both reflected the charm of the game and rendered it a catalyst for nostalgia for almost anyone playing, from the developers to those playing at the time of release to those playing in the future, whether they meant to or not. One of the effective ways that the music of Earthbound elicits nostalgic feelings is through the extensive use of 173 different audio samples. To understand why Tanaka and Suzuki packed the game with so many samples, we should take a look at the hardware of the SNES compared to the hardware of the original Nintendo Entertainment System. The audio processing unit for the NES allowed for only 5 channels of audio: 2 pulse wave generators, 1 triangle wave generator, 1 white noise generator, and 1 delta modulation channel for playing 1-bit delta pulse code modulated samples. The memory needed to store audio samples had to be allocated from the main processor's 2 kilobyte memory, so any included samples had to be small and compressed. As such, these 1-bit samples were of extremely low fidelity, as you can hear in this speech sample from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3. Cowabunga! In developing the hardware for the Super Nintendo, Nintendo paired up with Sony to ensure that their new system would have the strongest possible audio capabilities. While the audio processing unit for the NES was tied to the central processing unit, the Super Nintendo had an entire audio subsystem that included a dedicated 8-bit processor, an 8-channel 16-bit digital signal processor, and 64 kilobytes of memory. For context, 64 kilobytes is roughly 80 times smaller than the average MP3 file, but it was still a huge upgrade over the memory allotted for audio on the Nintendo. Furthermore, the DSP made use of wavetable lookup synthesis, which allowed composers to create soundtracks using short samples of digital audio recordings on all 8 channels rather than being restricted to an internal signal generator. This meant that, among other things, composers could now use actual recordings of beach soundscapes. Instead of having to approximate one with white noise. Earthbound was only the second SNES game that Tanaka had composed for, and the first SNES game Keiichi Suzuki had composed for, so it's understandable that the pair would want to take full advantage of the new system's audio processing power. Several songs in Earthbound are actually remakes of songs that originally appeared in the game's 1989 Japan-only predecessor, Mother, and one can easily hear the difference an upgrade in hardware made. While the original square waves and noisy percussion are charming in their own way, one can speculate that in remaking the track with samples of acoustic guitars, fretless bass, and organs, Tanaka and Suzuki were nostalgically yearning for how the song originally sounded in their head 5 years prior. Similarly, compare the song Snowman from both games. For those who played Mother before Earthbound, hearing the extra details and atmosphere of these reimagined songs would likely conjure bittersweet feelings of the time and place where they played the original game. Beyond the use of instrument samples, Tanaka and Suzuki also embedded several voice recordings of their coworkers in the game. Anyone who's seen an old home video can understand how a recording can be a powerful trigger for nostalgic emotions. It's an immutable record of a specific time and person which allows one to relive a specific memory both orally and visually, and research has shown that our senses are linked to emotional memories in our brains. Also, given the long 5-year development period for Earthbound, hearing the voices of coworkers they had worked with for the game would likely conjure emotional memories for anyone on the development team, whether or not this was the intention of Tanaka and Suzuki. Some of these samples were recorded with the express permission of their artists, such as the voice of Master Belch, performed by an 8-Bank employee who was notorious for being able to burp and fart on command. Other co-workers found their way into the game by whistling, singing, or humming. The voice of composer Keiichi Suzuki can also be found in several places in the game.
I miss you.
Other samples, while credited in the game, were recorded candidly. For example, the "Okay desu ka?" or "Is this okay?" voice sample of Earthbound's director and producer Shigesato Itoi was recorded and included in the game without his knowledge. Itoi was also candidly recorded humming, as can be heard in Dungeon Man. Perhaps the most interesting candidly recorded sample is the overdriven guitar sample that can be heard upon starting the game. While this is credited to an M.D. Seeger, this is actually a candid recording of legendary video game designer Shigeru Miyamoto. While the inclusion of these audio sample Easter eggs is interesting, Tanaka and Suzuki's constant samples of and reference to Western and Japanese pop music of decades prior present the player with a more relatable type of nostalgia. It should be noted that in an article from Shigesato Itoi's website chronicling the musical inspirations for the soundtrack of the Mother series, almost all of the albums and artists referenced by Tanaka and Suzuki are from the late 60s to the late 70s, when the composers would have been in their teens and 20s, which for many people is a time of personal change, growth, and reflection. And given the themes of identity present throughout Earthbound, it's likely that Tanaka and Suzuki drew inspiration from the music of their adolescence and early adulthood, partially due to the nostalgia they had for that music and the memories they had for music of that time period. Some of these influences are never explicitly utilized in-game. For example, Tanaka wanted the soundtrack for Mother to evoke the same Americana-inspired depth that he felt listening to the music of Randy Newman, stating, "There are a few songs like Short People. I don't really know any English though. I wonder what kind of impression they'd have on me if I listened to them as an English speaker. Either way, the lyrics are unique. I especially love the chord progression and the arrangements. It's really deep and vast. I really admire it." Towards the beginning, I felt very strongly that I wanted to put this kind of sound world at the heart of Mother. Similarly, influence was likely drawn from the microgenre of Western-sounding Japanese pop music, Shibuya-ke. Director Shigesato Itoi, in an interview with Hippon Super magazine, stated that he wanted kids playing Earthbound to at least get a taste of the aura of the Shibuya-ke band Flipper's guitar. After hearing some of the music of Earthbound, it's easy to draw parallels with the kitschy, genre-fusing, and sample-heavy music of Shibuya-ke bands like Flipper's guitar. Other musical influences are explicitly sampled in-game. These include artists like the Plastic Ono Band, The Beatles, and the Beach Boys. Also sampled were television programs like Monty Python's Flying Circus, and Little Rascals, or Our Gang. Other musical influences were more egregiously copied and remade with the SNES's digital signal processor, such as Chuck Berry. The Champs, even the infamous reggae dancehall slang tang rhythm as made famous by Wayne Smith. And of course, the Beatles again. Tanaka and Suzuki's musical references were not limited to recording artists, however. They also found space to include the national anthems of America and France, as heard in All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. Several arcade games from the 80s were also sampled, such as Xevious. And Sheriff. These sources were all embedded in the Western pop culture consciousness by the late 80s and would likely enhance Earthbound's setting of an idiosyncratic and idealistic Americana-inspired world for any discerning listener nostalgic for the music of decades past. But what about someone like me, who first played Earthbound in 2012? Why does the game's soundtrack still elicit nostalgic feelings from me despite not playing the game at its release time? Given its massive financial failure in the United States, I, like many Americans in my age demographic, was first exposed to the characters and music of Earthbound by an entirely different series of games.
This game's winner is...
As an uncoordinated 6-year-old in 1999, I struggled with unlocking any of the secret characters in Super Smash Bros. For the Nintendo 64, so a friend came over and unlocked them all for me. While Captain Falcon's origins were also a mystery to me, I was more intrigued by Ness, the main character of Earthbound. He was a psychic boy that fought with yo-yos and baseball bats, and I really enjoyed the catchy song that played whenever he won a fight. By 2001, my fine motor skills had improved, and I was able to unlock Ness on my own in Super Smash Bros. Melee for the GameCube. Earthbound had a much larger presence in this game, with the inclusion of several remixes of songs and references to characters. When I first became comfortable with emulating video games around 2012, Earthbound was one of the first games that I played. I'd spent over a decade pondering the suburban setting of this game and listening to music from it, and I wanted to see if the game was as charming as I had built it up to be in my head. Shortly after booting it up, I was hooked. The game felt so familiar and comfortable despite never playing it before. I was being bombarded with references to my own childhood, from the Beatles and Beach Boys records that my parents had listened to songs that I recognize from the Super Smash Bros. Series, to even the low-fidelity timbre of the SNES soundtrack that reminded me of the times when I was 5 and my sister was 8 and my parents would let us rent Donkey Kong Country 2 or Super Mario World in our hotel room when we were in the process of moving. Towards the end of my playthrough, upon assembling all 8 Soundstone melodies, I finally heard the original source of Ness's victory song from Super Smash Bros. Despite the simplistic visual design and primitive UI design of the game, it was the first time a video game had really made me feel emotional. Recalling the fond childhood memories I had of playing video games with my sister and my friends filled me with a nostalgic yearning for a simpler time. In this way, the music of Earthbound has transcended its own nostalgic influences and become a nostalgia-inducing entity of its own. While Tanaka and Suzuki filled the soundtrack of Earthbound with musical references to their early adulthood and teenage years, I had my own nostalgic associations with the same source material and overall character of the soundtrack. As a side note, it's entirely possible that a generation of sports-loving Japanese children may have encountered the music of Earthbound first as a fight song for their favorite player of the Nippon Ham Fighters. Over the 5-year development period of Earthbound, Hirokazu Tanaka and Keiichi Suzuki were able to fill the game's soundtrack with nostalgic references to their own development team and the music of their adolescence and early adulthood. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge that while the music of Earthbound is very nostalgic for me personally, I recognize that's not necessarily a universal association. I had a very specific and privileged background of being able to play video games and listen to popular music of my parents' generation when I was growing up, that I know contributes greatly to my own emotional response to Earthbound. That being said, the soundtrack is so full of references that anyone familiar with Western popular culture from the 60s to the 90s will likely find some nostalgic or emotional foothold in the sound of the game. Even for someone without any knowledge of the references included, the entire soundtrack is able to stand on its own with this bittersweet and hopeful quality, and it remains an emotionally effective background to a story about believing in and caring for those around you.